Adventuring is supposed to be fun and exciting and carefree, hence being an adventure. How come I keep getting saddled with more responsibility as this all goes on? When does it stop? Even though he was really just talking rhetorically, Danny seemed to think of it as a serious question. Well, now that's an interesting point of discussion. There are a lot of fan theories about your death, or if you're even truly dead when I was last in my present. She started to explain. Fan theories? No, you know what? I don't want to know. Steve waved his arms again. Just fucking tell us. If you're not behind the disappearances and flesh puddles, and the fish guy cult isn't here for dragon bones, then why are they here? Well, that's simple. Danny started, but then on the other side of the open room and behind her was a massive echoing trumpet blast that made Steve and the others groan and clutch at their ears for a moment. Then a figure even larger than Danny stepped forth out of the shadows of the other entrance to the chamber. Standing a good 25 feet tall is as a massive creature of slick, slimy-looking flesh that's covered in purple, green, and yellow runic tattoos that seem to crawl about under the skin, even as Steve watched. While it had a vaguely humanoid shape in that it has 2 arms and 2 legs connected to a torso, it was not human in any way. There are 4 different trunks stretched out from the top part of its body that Steve figured counted as the face above a beard of tentacles, along with a dozen tusks growing out from around the trunks and even sides and top of its face, while 4 broad, wiggling ears flapped like flat, pulsating worms at the back. 2 blood-red orbs were set in on the sides of its face, glaring at the room with so much hatred Steve could feel it radiating out. Oh fuck, it's a Cthulhuphant. He quickly grabbed his spellbook and began to flip through as pandemonium gripped the rest of the chamber. Danny's employees began to rush around to their various positions or rush towards it to try and hold it back. But the massive fists of the giant twisted abomination just swept down, knocking them back. Even as the others began to fan out, trying to figure out how to help, Danny jumped over the altar in the center of the chamber and quickly approached Steve, who was still flipping through his book. Wait, why am I looking? Just tell us how we defeat it, Steve shouted up as Danny got close. What do you mean? She asked, and quickly grabbed reagents from the pouches on her armor, slapping her hands together as a magic barrier popped up before the Cthulhuphant, stopping his fist mid-swing from smashing more of her employees. However we beat it, obviously we win, or you wouldn't be from the future, right? Steve asked. Reality doesn't work like that. It can all unravel across all times if it happens once in the wrong place. Besides, I haven't lived this part yet. And just because I remember you now doesn't mean I would later if you get unmade in reality. Steve tried to process what she'd just told him, and groaned, clenching his eyes shut as it hurt his head. But then he opened his eyes again as he felt a large hand suddenly grabbing him around the torso. Okay, time for strategy number 5, eh? I don't know what that means, he shouted as she picked him up and pulled back her arm. Distract him for a while and try not to get unmade, she replied as she threw him through the air. Just as the Cthulhuphant smashed the barrier apart with his fists, Steve flew through the opening and screamed as he hit the creature square in the face. But rather than slam into what he figured would be hard flesh, he got sucked into it and came out the other side in somewhere. All around him were floating rocks in a green and black gaseous void, with purple lightning cracking through the clouds constantly. He pulled his arms in close and tried to lean down to avoid some tumbling debris before him, and then aimed as best he could for a somewhat flat rock. As he got close, he tucked his legs up and hit the rock, rolling to break his fall as best he could. When he jumped back up to his feet, he began to flip through his book once more. Fuck! Where did I put down my notes? See? It's not here. Wait, F! He flipped forward to the F section. Here it is! Fish Guy Cult! He flipped forward a bit in his book. Fish Guy Cult Monsters. Cthulhuphant. One pissed-off pachyderm created through an elaborate cult ritual involving the ritual sacrifice of a dire elephant, or possibly Elephant King. Avoid entering their mind hole as it leads to a mental pathway leading to the sleep realm of an elder... something. Extremely dangerous. He paused and looked around the floating void. Fuck. He ducked then as a rock went sailing past his head and kept reading. If in nightmare realm be aware of lightning and flying exploding squid skulls. As he said that, he looked up and saw several creatures that seemed to be little more than tentacles attached to a face with wings and burning eyes. About 4 of them were headed right for him as he cursed and jumped off the floating rock he was on. The squid skulls slammed into the rock and ruptured in a green and purple explosion as he was sent flying through the void. Screaming as he was sent flying through the nothingness, he tried to flail and swing his arms around to slow his flight, but was coming in very quickly towards another chunk of rock. This time he couldn't as gracefully tuck and roll, and instead more tumbled and bounced across the surface before coming to a stop on his face. Steve groaned as he coughed out some dirt and started to push himself up when he saw a pair of boots in front of his face. He slowly looked up and discovered that the boots were attached to himself. Except different him. It was certainly him, but his beard and hair had distinguished streaks of gray that made him look significantly more trustworthy for some reason. Oh, thank fuck. Future self here to help me out. I was worried. Also nice hair. Thanks. I like it too. But I'm not here to help. I'm just waiting here so I can steal this and do my own thing. The future Steve was looking up at the sky as present Steve struggled to his feet. Steal what? He asked, just as future Steve raised his hand. Steve miniature son from earlier came flying in out of the gaseous void around them and into future Steve's hand. Yoink! See you later, he said as he jumped up and flew off into the void as the star burnt away the clouds around him as he went. Wait! Get back here and help me, you son of a bitch! Present Steve angrily shouted before blinking. Shit. All I did was insult my own mother. Cussing out time selves is tricky. It's not that hard, just wreck stuff. And try flying, idiot! Future Steve called out as he disappeared in the distance. Oh, right. Destroy stuff. Durr! Steve smacked his own forehead and then pulled his book up once more. Movement subsection flight. Which one? Which one? He quickly pulled out a twig from the inverted forest and a weightless pebble, jamming them both into one of his highest-grade arcane dust vials, before slamming the cap back on and then shaking it as hard as he could for a few seconds while speaking the power words. Soon the vial splintered and evaporated as the glittery substance that spilled out quickly coated his body. He waited a bit longer for it to finish, and then jumped off the rock and found himself floating in the void rather than hurtling through it wildly. Success! He shouted out, which drew the attention of another flock of flying squid skulls. A pod? A squad? Bring it, bitches! He shouted rather than continue to worry about how one should refer to a group of such creatures. Quickly focusing, he summoned a lightning bolt and shot it out at the skulls just to see the lightning bounce between them harmlessly. Fuck! Right. Lightning void probably means you're used to that. Plan B. He quickly changed up his casting to summon fireballs from his hands, tossing them at the quickly approaching eyes. When one hit the skull, ruptured and exploded, which then consumed the others around it. Fuck yes! Steve shouted and looked around trying to make sense of the void around him. There were 2 large milky moons in the sky, somewhat ahead of him. Below, he could see shrouded towers or pillars in the mist, and when he turned around he saw what looked like some sort of intricate set of gray canyons. Of course, all around him were the rocks, slowly tumbling around through the clouds as well. As he looked around, he saw one of the rocks seem to spin, and another flock of squid skulls came flying out of it. He flew towards that particular rock then, and prepped more fireballs as he hurled them through the air as he flew closer. He was getting the hang of nailing the skulls with the fireballs when they began to spread out, making it harder for him to get them all in one blast. But by then he was close enough to see the rock was in fact a spherical creature that seemed to be a host or hive for the skulls which popped out of the writhing, fleshy orb as if they were disgusting pimples. "How's this to brighten your day?" Steve called out as he hurled fireballs at it. But while the fire ruptured the flying skulls, the hive just seemed to absorb the impacts as if it were nothing. In fact, he saw its eyes begin to glow red, and then had to quickly twist and spin as it spat several of his fireballs right back at him. "New plan!" Steve screamed, even as he had to fly through a tiny gap between some floating rocks to avoid the fireballs being tossed back at him. He quickly reached into his pouches and pulled out several more reagents and pressed them into another arcane vial. This time he waited before saying the words. Instead, he turned and flew straight at the squid hive, twisting and dodging to avoid more fireballs being lobbed towards him. Just as he came in close, he finally shouted out the words and tossed the vial into the eye of the hive, just as he turned around in midair to bring his feet down first, stomping the vial right into its flesh. The creature screeched in pain as Steve felt the sudden cold, and a spike of ice shot straight through the hive, having grown from the vial he stomped on. "Fuck yeah!" she shouted in success as the hive began to immediately wither and die around him, turning to ash that broke off like dust into the void. But even as he did that, he could hear a loud rumbling sound and looked around for a moment before looking up and seeing one of the milky white moons turning around in the sky before he saw a massive red pupil focus in on him. "Oh, it's a giant eye! Oh shit, it's a giant eye!" He gasped as he realized he must be essentially inside the Cthulhufan's head somehow. All around him he heard more screeching and hissing and saw dozens upon dozens of squid skulls start to fly out, now aimed by the eye and seeking him out. Fuck, fuck, fuck! Steve looked around trying to figure out what to do for a minute. He knew lightning wouldn't work, fire likely wouldn't, and he didn't have any way to make an ice spike big enough to pull the same trick twice. That's when he focused on one of the giant tumbling rocks in the void. Flying over to it as fast as he could, he landed on the surface and pulled out his most expensive scroll and slapped it to the surface of the rock before pulling out 2 arcane dust vials and pouring them all over the scroll. "Hope like shit this works," he muttered as he quickly cut his finger and began to scribble on the scroll in his own blood. Once the runes were finished, the scroll flashed and burned away. He hoped that meant good things, and then grabbed the rock with both hands. Even though it was a massive boulder several times his size, he slowly was able to turn with it in his hands as he kept his feet up in the void. Both he and the rock began to spin around, slowly at first, but with building speed. As the skulls swooped in to try and slam into Steve, he kept spinning the rock around, knocking the rock into them instead, as they ruptured and exploded across the surface. Steve kept spinning in place, though, turning the rock around him as if he were on solid ground and spinning around before throwing a discus. Just as he could almost no longer hold on, he waited and then released as the boulder went flying towards the massive moon-sized eye. As the rock flew, it began to spin and fly faster and faster as his momentum spell took effect, constantly increasing the speed at which the rock was flying. He couldn't be sure, but he thought it might even have burst into flames just before slamming into the giant red pupil. "Bullseye!" he shouted just as everything around him rumbled and shook, making him bounce and sway in the void. "Bwah! The fuck!" he shouted as he saw part of the red pupil crack and crumble as green liquid poured out of it, which made everything around him seem to go crazy. Lightning bolts began shooting off all around him. The flying skulls were exploding in midair, and far down below him, writhing masses he could barely see seemed to be rolling around in pain. But then there was more rumbling as the second eye spun around in the air above him, and the next red pupil focused on him. This time he saw it grow brighter and brighter, and realized it was no longer content to just toss flying skulls at him. Uh-oh! Steve began flying as fast as he could just as a red beam shot out of the second eye and scorched everything in the air just behind him. "Fuck!" Steve screamed as he flew, twisting and turning between tumbling rocks as the eye beam shot out again, carving right through the rock Steve was trying to use as cover. He soon felt a wind pulling at his hair and clothes, however, and looked up to see a purple vortex spinning around in the void between the ruptured eye and the one shooting eye beams at him. Without any other idea on what to do, he turned up towards it. Still spinning and flying as fast as he could to avoid the deadly eye beam, he flew straight into the purple swirling vortex, hoping for the best. After a moment, he found himself being tossed out of the vortex and noticed that his body was no longer covered in his arcane flying powder. "Oh shit!" he cried out and did his best to try and pull his arms up to shield his face as he prepared to crash into some sort of gray wall ahead of him. But just as he thought he was about to hit something, grabbed him around the waist, and he gasped as the air was knocked from his lungs due to the tight squeeze. But he didn't hit the wall. Gasping for air, he found himself spun around as he had a chance to look around. He was in the bright sunshine of a rather gorgeous day. The sky was a crisp, clear blue. It wasn't too hot or too cold, and he could see the wind gently blow the grass around him. He looked down to see a gray trunk around his waist, and was turned around in the air to come face to face with a six-tusked dire mammoth. He froze up as he looked as the giant furred cousin of an elephant, and wondered if he was about to get stomped to death. Instead, it slowly set him down on his feet and then nodded slightly. Then it turned around and began to walk away from Steve down a hill towards a river valley in the distance. Steve could see a whole herd of mammoths in the distance, young and old, some playing in the river, others just lounging about in the warm sun. He couldn't believe just how peaceful and serene everything seemed, which was when something gripped him by the back of the head and yanked hard. He screamed in surprise and flailed his arms as everything turned upside down, and then went black, then white, and then he was flying through the air as he realized he was back out in the chamber Danny had set up. "Fenrina, catch me!" he cried out, and saw the werehusky spin around for a moment before sprinting in the direction he was going and leaping into the air to grab him and pull him down into a hug. "Steve, you didn't get unmade or turned into a freaky tentacle face." As glad as Steve was to be alive, he had to gasp hard as the air was once more crushed out of his lungs and possibly suffering from cracked ribs. "Fenrina!" he gasped out. "Crushing!" "Oh!" The werehusky let go as he dropped a few inches to his feet and leaned against her, panting hard to catch his breath yet again. "Now aren't you glad we play fetch?" she asked as he recovered and nodded slowly. When he turned to look around the chamber, he saw that several pillars had been crushed, but the altar in the center of the room was glowing white, and the skull of a dire mammoth was set upon it. Danny, still towering over everyone else, was just finishing up carving protective runes into the bone. Her employees were scattered around, and Larry was tending to the wounded while Sherry was giving rites to the dead. "I guess we won?" he asked, leaning against Fenrina for a moment before staggering towards Danny. "We sure did," the large dragon lady cheerfully replied. "You distracted him long enough for me to get the ritual complete. I'm just making sure this poor guy won't be disturbed again. I have some scouts looking for any remains of the cult, but considering the size of ritual needed to bring out a Sithelhuffent, I'm guessing they're all dust. And now the boneyards will be safe again, and not a moment too soon either." Danny leaned back from the skull and looked at her hands as they began to become see-through. "Looks like I'm done here. Reality should be strong again, but that means I'm moving on." "Wait! I have so many questions!" Steve called out. "I told Fenrina some of the ones I figured you would ask, and that I can answer without destroying reality. I'll see you again! Eventually!" Danny kept fading until she entirely vanished with a soft pop sound echoing through the chamber. "Oh, she was talking to me?" Fenrina blinked and looked surprised as Steve looked at her. He narrowed his eyes as he saw the werehusky tap her chin. "You weren't listening, were you?" he asked. "No." Fenrina replied and slowly shrugged. Steve sucked in a deep breath and thought about just how much he wanted to cuss, and then saw Fenrina's worried expression. So his deep breath just came back out in a ragged sigh and he slumped his shoulders. "Whatever. I'll find out eventually. Let's just help out and then see what's going on in the rest of the boneyard." He shook his head as he went to find Larry and help healing Danny's employees, but was stopped by a kobold in a set of clothing that Steve wasn't familiar with. She was wearing a black skirt and some sort of fancy white shirt under a black jacket that had a cut to it he'd never seen before. Not only that, but she had 2 pieces of round glass wrapped in wire and set before her eyes, and around her neck was a red bit of cloth that reminded him of the focals most Almaran soldiers wore. But this one looked a bit more like a noose. "I'm Miss Duskmaw's secretary," the kobold explained as she stepped in front of him. "Her what? Oh, you're the one who I spoke to through the orb, aren't you? Really sorry about everything." Steve grimaced once more as he realized that her husband had been turned to a flesh puddle, and he'd just mentioned it in such an offhanded manner. "These things happen," the secretary mentioned and adjusted the wire glass on her face before holding up a set of scrolls before him. This is the complete list of all treasures and goods we possess, both magic and mundane. Okay? Steve asked as he took the scrolls with some hesitation. Why are you giving me this? I'm aware of the procedures of most adventurers. Without Miss Danny here, I believe that means all our possessions are now to be in your possession as loot. The kobold explained as Steve arched his brows in surprise. You think I'm going to take all your stuff? No, it's yours. He handed the scrolls back. Listen, all I want are a few choice pieces of ivory and bone, and that's it. You guys can have the rest. I'm not here to steal from you guys, honest. I just want to clear out the caves and let the locals start harvesting the boneyard again, okay? Steve explained, as the kobold narrowed her eyes and seemed to give him a suspicious look. Very well, I'll make the proper arrangements, the kobold said, and turned, walking off without another word. Steve just scratched his head in confusion. That was strange. I guess today has been strange all around, he muttered, and finally went to find Larry to help healing the survivors. It would take the adventurers another day to clean out the caves of the last traces of the fish guy cult. They'd discover a massive stockpile of bones and ivory, not to mention making the boneyard itself far safer now, without the dark influence of the cult. After all of that, and before heading back to Orbitus, Steve thought it would be best to prove his good intentions to both the locals and the survivors of Danny's employees. So Steve brought much of what they found up to the surface for the local laborers to have, which they would soon take back to the various ivory markets along the coast, which would dramatically lower the price of such goods since so many high-value bones were brought in at the same time. This had a significant impact on the Estrakhan economy, which relied on the highly valuable and, until now, rare magic and mundane ivory for their trade. As their economy began to suffer, the locals panicked and internal conflict began to rise. This then gave the Sethubians a chance to draw in more merchants as their ports remained stable, which furthered the sudden trade war between the two rival nations over what remained of the ivory trade. Both struggled to find new markets to make up for the loss of value of the ivory. However, as the Estrakhans began to run out of money to buy much-needed grain and food, there was only one nation willing to sell them food at prices low enough to prevent mass starvation and food riots. The Almarin Republic, which always maintained very high stockpiles of food thanks to their many wars and their efficient irrigation systems ensuring high yields, became Ostroko's most important trade partner, which meant when the Elven Coalition wanted to sail their navy down the Ivory Coast and across the ocean to get supplies and troops to the elves, the Estrakhan ports were suddenly closed to them. The coalition wasn't willing to declare an offensive war against the still geographically important nation, just for more favorable ports. This significantly hampered their logistical efforts for their war effort. Of course, over time, the cause of this trade war was traced back, and Steve was blamed for it, which gave him his mixed reputation with the Estrakhans. Many hated him for ruining their economy, while others remembered he was trying to do good and had saved them from the cult. As usual, Steve took this new reputation with a shrug and just accepted the good parts while ignoring the bad, especially when he heard of a new mercenary company in the region called the Dusk Devils that were run by a strange kobold in unusual clothes. He had a feeling he had somehow been played, but his focus was on Danny Duskmaw, and not the Archdean who had sent him on this quest in the first place. Of course, it wouldn't be the last time he met Danny, that much he knew for sure, but he simply didn't know when they'd meet again, or how disastrous that meeting would go. Yet that is a story for another time.